Welcome to Noble Warrior. My name is CK Lin, Noble Warriors, where I interview leaders, entrepreneurs about their journey from the first mountain of achievement to the second mountain of purpose. So you can go out and navigate your own journey from the first mountain to the second mountain. If you have any friends who are on this journey who could use more inspiration to take that leap of faith, go ahead and share this episode with them. They'll thank you for it. My next guest is Jonathan Brill. He's a former global futurist at Hewlett-Packard. He has published thought leadership articles for TED, Bloomberg, Fast Company, MIT, and Harvard Business Review. Today, he prepares businesses to profit from radical change. He's also the author of Rogue Waves, Future-Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. We talked about a number of topics. We're beginning to have better tools, better technologies, and better data to be able to predict probabilities of what's coming. So what happens when we tie ourselves to a set of assumptions which are no longer relevant or true? How to use mental models to navigate a very complex world. When you expect disruption in your lifetime, how will you design your company or organization? How to train yourself to have maximum optionality like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel. How he learned to manage complex processes in a Michelin star restaurant. Finally, how to properly engineer company culture to motivate and reward people to experiment and to innovate. Please enjoy my conversation with Jonathan Brill.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So first, let me just start out by saying from one systems thinker to another, let me just acknowledge you for presenting beautiful frameworks and examples to make this book as relevant and as practical and as valuable as possible. For those of you who are watching the recording, if you're a systems thinker and if you're a builder, go get this book. You won't regret it.
Thanks so much, CK. It's wonderful. I appreciate that a lot.
So let me actually read a passage, the conclusion of the book. So maybe that will frame this conversation a bit. Then we can go into more details of, what it is that you are trying to communicate. The true captains of modern business see a more complete reality. They look outward as well as inward. They listen broadly and they read more than recent history. They constantly look to coordinate and they're intensely skeptical. Anytime someone says, this has never happened before, often they've had some training in an academic discipline that balance abstract thinking with finding objective truth, such as applied mathematics, physics, computer science, economics, and so forth. They also tend to be comfortable with ambiguity, can base decisions on stacked up probabilities. When you know what's most likely and what's less likely, but also plausible, you can plan for a range of possible futures and invest in making your preferred outcome more likely. So I really love the way that you frame this. From the title point of view, it sounds a little bit of an alarmist, but talking to you and reading the book and really get to know you more, you're actually not an alarmist, are you?
I don't think so. I mean, I have a belief that what's really going on in the world right now is we have more trillion-dollar problems than ever before. But that also means that we have more trillion-dollar opportunities. And so I feel an urgency for the future, an urgency for change. But that's because there's more possibility today than there ever has been before. And it's our responsibility, our generation's responsibility, to make sure that we move humanity, we move civilization forward from where we have been to where we're going. I mean, when you think about this moment in time, we're at liftoff. We're at liftoff for the next generation of the human species. And what do I mean by that? It's not just that you have new technologies. It's not just that we have globalization. It's not that by 2035, another billion people will earn the local equivalent of the US middle class on the planet. It's not just that. It's that we're at a moment where things like artificial intelligence and explosion of sensing and communication technologies, statistical skills are making it possible for the first time to see the future. Now, I don't mean that we can tell you exactly what the world's going to look like 50 years from now. But what I'm telling you is this is the first time that we've had any ability to use things like climate modeling to see what that might be, and to use economic data to, in a real way, start to imagine what that might mean in your community, in your town, for your life. And that's not just true in climate change. That's just one of the exciting things right now because of the big climate conference coming up at the end of the month. It's happening in healthcare. It's happening in urban systems and urban design. It's happening in the way we create businesses. Right, all of the things that you see companies like Google, the things that you see companies like Facebook doing with being predictive about what you might want and what you might need, those skills, those technologies, those competencies, they're commoditizing. And that means that in the next 3-5 years, these are things that you'll be doing for yourself in your daily life. And what does that mean? It means that we have the tools of the most powerful organizations on earth coming into our hands. And we have more than an opportunity, we have a responsibility to use that to climb the next mountain.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the callback. Thank you. So I mean, one systems thinker to another, I think about the world systems and processes. So I love the way that you think, right? So why don't we start from the personal before we go into the global? Because that way it's a little bit easier to make it more relevant to the individual listeners. So I'm curious to know, I have been accused of, hey, CK, you're making this way too complicated. Your mental model, you're making things, complicated. But I say to them, no, it's a complex world. Yes, I cannot make a deterministic model what's to predict the future, but I can make it probabilistic. So at least things make sense to me, so then I can apply towards forward, right? So I'm curious for you, Jonathan, how do you use your own framework to navigate your own journey from the first mountain to the second mountain and pursuing
Yeah.
different opportunities that's available to you? Because the whole world is the playground for you, right? So how do you navigate that using your mental models?
So there's the world's complex, and that's a complex question.
Yes.
The first thing I would say is the goal that you should always be looking toward, no matter what happens in the future, is how do you increase your optionality, right? How do you increase the number of options? And how do you increase your potential when those options become available? And that should always be the thing that we're looking at. Whether we're program managing and we got to get to the end of the project, or whether we're looking at our careers and our lives. What's the broad range of things that are possible, and how do we take advantage of all of them should they occur? I think about when I was 18, and I was trying to think about my life and my career and where I wanted to go, and I had such clarity about what would happen. And I sat down and I talked with uh, my uncle, who was 95 at the time.
Mm.
And, he was a little bemused. And he says, Here, I finally figured it out. It's been almost 100 years, but I finally figured it out. Here's how life works. You do one thing, and then you look around and you decide what you do next. And then you do that. And that's all there is to it. His point was you can't actually know exactly what the future will be. You might have a kid you didn't expect. You might develop Alzheimer's. You might have epilepsy. There might be a car crash. Uh, your business might implode. A technology that you thought was really going to grow your business might become irrelevant tomorrow. I spent so much time learning how to type, right? And learning cursive. technologies that they're still kind of important, right? Knowing how to write and knowing how to use a keyboard, but in a world of increasing voice command and voice control and verbal virtual assistants and autofill, in many ways, so many of those skills are no longer relevant, and yet I thought they would be central to my success when I was 18. And so we've got to be looking not just at what we think the future is, but if that is untrue, how do we make sure that we're still setting ourselves up for success? And that's, I think, what the book's about. And that's kind of what I think about is how do you give yourself the best bet? How do you make sure you understand what's happening today? How do you understand that range of possibilities? How do you then make decisions that allow you to uncouple the downsides, make sure that no matter how bad things get, they don't kill you? How do you make sure that you're setting yourself up for the upsides? How do you just kind of work through decisions and often change small things about how you time, sequence, and hedge bets or investments so that that happens for you? And it's very much possible, but it requires a level of rigor and a comfort with complexity and ambiguity that uh, that is trained. I mean, you've got to spend time there. You've got to be willing to spend time there, and you've got to understand that the way to approach an ambiguous and increasingly volatile future isn't to have one plan. It's to be running a series of experiments, some high potential, some kind of sustaining, keeping the business going, and some insurance experiments, some things just to make sure that no matter what goes wrong, you know you've got that foundation that you need.
Yeah.
And most companies, most people, they don't think that way. um, but when you take a look at something like the pharmaceutical industry, they do this very much. They'll look at like 100 molecules and run them in a horse race so that they can reliably have they're doing enough experiments so that they can reliably have the combination of outcomes that they need when they need them. We see this in the stock market, right? You would never invest in one stock, just invest in Amazon and hope, or invest in Bitcoin and hope. Like, maybe you're going to strike it super rich, but you're setting yourself up for volatility that you can't control, right? That it increases your potential when it goes up, but it eliminates your potential when it goes down. And so the thing is, in most businesses, most planning, we kind of think about compound growth, this idea that we'll do better and better and better and better and better and better, right? But we forget that in a volatile world, you also have compound volatility, right? That the
Mm,
markets or whatever, you know,
mm.
trying to get in the camera here, they
And, and,
they
and
do
really,
this.
that's what the
And
book is about, right?
yeah,
Rogue
and
waves, right?
that's what the book's about, is that compound
Mm,
volatility. What happens when these individually manageable changes collide to become unmanageable? And how do you
yeah,
make sure that you've maximized your potential and your optionality when that
yeah,
happens?
yeah. So there's a few things that. So by the way, this is Noble Warrior. So on this podcast, we talk. I have a scientific background. So on this podcast, we talk a lot about life as an infinite game, right? You
Mhm.
play the game in so that you can continue to play the game. It's not a
Sure.
finite game, right? So that's one.
Right.
Two, Noble Warrior. We use the dojo analogy quite a lot, right? It's not about, you know, mastering a move and I'm done and I can declare myself black belt. It's actually going onto the mat and continue to practice some fundamental skills so then
Yeah.
you can skill stack your way to unpredictable scenarios when a situation calls for it.
Right.
It's you don't need to like, oh my god, what do I do? It's like, oh, muscle memory, then I can actually react with more
Right.
grace and finesse and dignity that way.
Yeah.
So I would just want to bring some of the parallels of something that
Yeah.
you've been saying.
Yeah.
One thing you didn't say is implicitly is what is the game that you're playing? What are you optimizing for? Right.
Mm.
So understanding the why you do certain things, so then you can think about the atomic level skills that you want to stack and practice and
Mhm.
be masterful at so you
Mhm.
can move towards your goals. Anything you want to say about the importance of having clarity of the direction of you heading towards?
So I think having some understanding of why you're doing what you're doing is incredibly important. You know, I think it's really easy if you get too focused on the why to miss um, that the world's changed. And I'm not talking about personal growth work. I'm talking about in business that it's really easy to say, here's my definition of success. We're going to be the number one widget maker in the world. And then you get there and no one cares about widgets. Like I spent up until I was about 40 trying to do things to please my dad, trying to have the skills that when my dad was 40, he wanted me to have. I was 10. Guess what? It takes about 30 years. So I turned 40 and I got there and I had most of those skills. The last major thing I needed to do, probably like in terms of my life goals, was write a book, which I've now done. My point is, I sat down with my dad and I'm like, what do I do next? And he's like, I don't know. Why'd you do that? Like, my point is, I thought I was achieving something my dad cared about. And by the time I got there, maybe 30 years ago he did. But by the time I got there, he didn't care anymore. And so I think we've always got to understand when the environment's changing and when we've tied ourselves to a set of assumptions that are no longer relevant or no longer true. And I think that's kind of the great skill, is having the tenacity to get there, but also understanding when there has changed.
So one thing that I want to say in the quote that I read a little while ago, you said that I'm paraphrasing: strong business leader, excellent business leader are both internally aware and externally aware.
Yes.
So I want to, maybe I'm projecting my words, into your mouth, so to speak. You're not saying just like, hey, pay attention to the external world. Yes, you're saying that. And also, you're also saying be cognizant about your internal goal. Like, why are you doing this for? Yes,
Yeah.
no, maybe so.
If you're chasing someone else's cheese, like, why are you doing that?
Right.
Like, why are you chasing another mouse's cheese? Like, it's a developmental path. You talk about the first mountain and the second mountain, right? It's a developmental path. Often for me, it was, or has been, or is. You get to the top of the first mountain, and that's really, for me, in a lot of ways, chasing what my father wanted, what he couldn't accomplish for personal reasons, and like my own flavor of it. But it was really chasing someone else's goals and then getting there and realizing, oh, wow, I've actually done it all. Now what are my goals?
Yes.
How do I want to be in the world? And like you said, it's that for me right now, it's about that journey of self-awareness, about understanding my relationship to everyone else as opposed to everyone else's relationship to me.
So if you don't mind, can we drill in on a little bit more on the
Yeah.
personal? Okay. I'll
Yeah.
thank you for that. So most people don't have the wherewithal, the mental tools, the metacognition, right? The frameworks and mental models, the
Yeah.
vast experience that you have had. So my encouragement typically for them is, hey, let's build some mental models for you. So at least you have some simple tools to help you make decisions, right? That's aligned with your soul, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
But in your case, you have plenty of tools. Does it make it easier, or is it or does it make it harder to find that intrinsic whisper of an inspiration of what you're really about?
I think there are two answers to the question. What am I really about? What is my egocentric goal in the world? It's to explore as much as I can, to see as much as I can, to know as much about everything as I can. It turns out that's not a goal that most people have. Like, most people don't wake up on Tuesdays and think, gosh, I want to read this book. Or think, if I'm not doing hardcore learning several hours a day, I'm not feeling alive. That's took me a long time to realize that's not most people's path, right?
Me
It's
and you
mine.
both. I relate. I relate.
Yeah, it's my path. It's a weird path.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and so I'm really clear on that part of me. The new question, the new whisper for me is about what's my relationship to others, right? As I start to move from being the student to being, this is not quite right, but it's my Mr. Miyagi moment or something, from being the student to being the teacher, right? Or the
Hmm.
student to being the master to now
Hmm.
being the teacher. And how do I move from that uh, uh, kind of shift from being the rock star to being the host,
Hmm.
into being the person who creates the space for everyone else? And it's a different place for me, at least, to be in the planet. I am really enjoying being there and trying to figure out what it means.
Mm.
um and uh from a financial viewpoint, and from a success metric viewpoint, right? What does success at doing this mean for me? um so that's kind of the new whisper.
Cool.
And I'm trying to turn up the volume on that right now.
No, beautiful. Well, that's something I'm deeply passionate about. How do you essentially? So one secret passion, I'll make it public. What the heck? Uh, is I believe so. There's different trends, right? Population's aging. Uh, automation's coming online. Therefore, and then people don't have enough to retire. So
Mm,
therefore, the aging population, there's a huge need to continue to be back in the workforce.
mhm,
But right now, it's actually cheaper to say, hey, thank you for your service. You're out, right? Kind
mhm,
of, it's cheaper for companies to do that. So
mhm,
there's an on-tap workforce, right? Talent pool that
mhm,
want to continue to engage and be relevant. So
mhm,
then, how can we create the bridge so that they can continue to contribute, right,
mhm.
to make a living, to find significance in their work, to have relevance to the career and so forth.
Yeah.
Bigger question that I'm exploring, and this is something that I'm deeply passionate about. And for me, I think the answer lies in courses. I believe there's a lot of wisdom and experience
Yeah.
that these people can turn into products, right? Courses, and then to
Mhm,
really benefit a lot of people. And I've seen
mhm,
just a lot of different successes amongst even my friends. So this is an area that I'm really kind of thinking about.
mhm. So my question, and I think what you're suggesting is kind of online courses.
Hmm.
My question is, you know, how quickly does that commoditize? Right? There's only going to be one. When I was teaching, I used to like to teach illustration skills for architects and interior designers. And
Mm.
um, what I rapidly realized was there's this guy named Ryan Church who did a lot of the concept art for the second round of Star Wars movies. And he was a much better teacher and illustrator than I ever was. And he put out DVDs. I was like, he's like, I'm not ever going to be a better teacher of that skill than he is. But what I can do, is start to look at what are the things students aren't getting, right? What are the
Hmm.
aspects of what he's teaching? So I play the videos during my class, and then I go around and work with the students individually on the little blocking and tackling issues. And that created the best of both worlds, where you had a really differentiated product in terms of what I was able to teach, and you had like a best in class product in terms of this DVD.
Yep.
And so I think that we're going to have to figure out not just how do you put LinkedIn learning courses on video. I mean, that's all important. But how do you do the second piece of
Yep.
the
I am a
things
huge,
we need
I'm
to
a
learn
huge,
individually?
yeah, I'm a huge geek around transformational learning. So it's not
Yeah.
just content dump on someone
Mhm.
and then say your job is done. Rather
Mhm.
is actually delivering the benefit of,
Yeah.
hey, here's what I was before. Here's what I want to go after.
Right.
But whole different conversation, different rabbit hole. I want to focus on your book. So
Okay.
maybe we could talk about that offline. Um, let's see. So one key big ideas that you have is, hey, history repeats itself.
Mhm.
Look at the past, look at the present, and look at them systematically as a way
Mhm.
to anticipate and predict the future, a la being the dojo. So then when, unpredictable black swan event happens, you're ready to go. Did
Mhm.
I capture the big ideas correctly? Is there anything you wanted to qualify what I just said?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd put a little more specificity on it. My argument is that if you look at a longer historical period, a lot of things have happened before. The outcomes might have been different, um, but we can actually see. There was a day in 1927 when the Mississippi was 80 miles wide. Back then, it displaced 600,000 people. Today, it'd be 16 million people, right? So we can look at these things. We can look at 1918 and probably in some of the First World War. Um, we see the Spanish flu breaking out, and we see the economic impact. We see the actions that were taken. We see the dominoes that fall afterward. And so we can know a lot, not just about what has happened, but the follow-on impact afterward. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. Um, the second piece is, we talk about black swan events, these individual, these incalculable risks that fall out of the sky. Um, the reality is those are much more rare than you might imagine. The guy who coined that term, a guy named Nassim Nicholas Taleb, uh, he said COVID wasn't a black swan event, that 2008 wasn't a black swan event. Uh, September 11th, while we didn't know the day, like the fact that there was going to be a terrorist attack on the United States by Al Qaeda, like that was a radically increasing probability. And so when we take a look at these things, the issue isn't like what day do they happen, it's how likely are they to happen. And I think that's what we fail to calculate was pandemics were a radically increasing probability, zoonotic things that move from animals to humans seems to be an increasing probability. Um, and what we missed because we gotten better at containing them over the last couple of decades was that eventually the dike, the water was going to go over the dike. This is the thing we perpetually miss in Louisiana, right? Like, I don't know. It's at the head of the Mississippi. Eventually, the water is going to go over the dike. Eventually, Mother Nature is going to win. The question isn't how often that occurs. That's not what you should be paying attention to. It's what's the following impact when that
Yeah.
occurs. Are you ready to take advantage of that change,
So
or
here's the
are you just
challenge
going to be
though.
there trying to bail out your ship?
I'm sorry I keep interrupting, but here's the challenge, Jonathan,
Yeah,
that nobody likes to buy insurance, right? The question isn't if a disaster will hit you in your lifetime. The question is always when, right? So that's why you buy insurance. But the reality is nobody likes to be reminded of their mortality, of their fragility of life. So nobody likes to buy insurance. So
sure.
then this is how do you position, right, the marketing aspect of it, so then they would buy insurance, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and I think the reality that we miss, at least in business, is that during the 20th century, there were about four major business shocks a year, right? Whether it was a legal thing like civil rights law or the foundation of the creation of new regulatory agencies or a world war or whatever it was. Um, things like that happened about 4 times a year. And so the question isn't how do you create insurance? It's how does your life change? How does your planning change when you expect to be disrupted, as opposed to when you try to avoid it? When you expect to be disrupted, you design your organizations, you design your life very differently. Like we can try and kind of uh, armor our ship, build an aircraft carrier, or we can try and be a kayak that might tip a little more, but when it gets flipped, it responds faster. When you take a look at a business market, at least, what you see is that most strategy assumes that the playing field will be even, right? That it won't change. And so what you want to do is build a strategy assuming that the rules will stay the same. Well, that never seems to work. What you need to do is build a strategy that assumes the rules will change and
Hmm.
figure out how to take advantage of that. It's a harder question for sure.
Got it. So, okay.
But
But my insurance metaphor is wrong because ultimately you're saying it's not about recovering the downside. Rather, it's how do you become anti-fragile, so to speak? How do you recover faster,
absolutely.
but also stronger and grow from it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Got
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah. And
Got it.
and I think yeah, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he's very who's the guy who coined that term anti-fragile, as well as the black swan. He's really good at coining terms. Um, he's a mathematical economist and who played in the stock market, ran enterprise risk types of things in the stock market for a long time. So he's really good, at explaining statistics and the impact of statistics. What my book does that's slightly different is it comes from the role of a practitioner who's been in business, right? About like, okay, well, how do you actually apply this? Like, instead of saying anti-fragile is an important thing, it's how do you become anti-fragile?
Right. Yeah, you're the sensei, right? You're the dojo master trying to teach other people how to think the way you think. So actually, let's fast forward on that note just a bit. Now that you have certain mastery, right, with these mental models and ways to think about things and then anticipate, fragile or fragility causing events, things like that. Can you paint us a picture, a movie of what's possible when you have that black belt level skills? What's life like? What's company could like? So that way, people who don't have that white belt level can like,
Yeah,
oh, black belt level.
yeah,
Now I could
black
see,
belt.
right?
Yeah. So I mean, Elon Musk is a great example of setting yourself up uh, to do massive things. Um, he typically does things that are, if you look forward into the future, these are things that should exist, that governments will support if they get to a certain scale and then falter, um, and that the current industrial structure makes impossible. And so he looks for an environmental shift that will need to happen in the future. He looks at industries that are not able to make that shift, and then he figures out how he's going to have that backstop. In 2008, right, SpaceX almost went belly up, and NASA had to back him. And why did they do that? It wasn't because they believed in SpaceX particularly. It's that they were tired of the Lockheeds and the Boeings of the world jacking up the price of space, and they saw this third party that even if it wasn't successful could force down prices. And so
Mm,
he found a way, he found a lever that was far bigger than him that could guarantee his success if he got to that certain place, right? Whether that was intentional that time or not, it's certainly become a part of his toolkit moving forward. And so when you look at someone like Peter Thiel, you look at someone like Elon Musk, they repeatedly use these tools to either think through which investments are smart investments or to operate companies that will benefit from change.
mm. So essentially, well, what you didn't say this. This is my interpretation. Is, hey, here's where I want to go. Let me think about what other players, the secondary effects, right? How this could change the dynamics of the game, and then basically move to dynamics where they're incentivized to help you once you get to a certain size or a certain
Right.
positioning. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, and let's get specific about what happened with Elon Musk and SpaceX, because I think it's a good example. We look at this as an incredibly innovative company. It sure is, but what really happened there? Coming out of the Cold War, spending on space was dropping. No one was buying R&D for new intercontinental ballistic missiles, so on and so forth. At the same time, semiconductor technology, computer technologies were decreasing the size that satellites needed to be. Right, the space shuttle was designed basically so you could release satellites, but by the time that it got built, satellites were smaller, and then they dropped another, category of size after that by 2005, 2006. And so Musk looked at this and he said, okay, the Lockheeds, the Boeings of the world, they're designed to do what the government wants. The government no longer wants intercontinental ballistic missile systems or whatever we were saying we were doing with rockets for NASA, but they no longer want those heavy lift systems. And yet these companies are tied as prime contractors to the government to do things the government says. So if I do things the government doesn't care about, and these guys are stuck with their high cost labor and their 50-year-old PhDs and so on and so forth because they've got to have them for defense reasons, then I can get a long way before they even start competing. And that's exactly what he did. The second thing that I think is really interesting about the early phases of SpaceX is the types of agile systems, the types of project management approaches they were using. Yes, they came out of PayPal. Yes, they came out of Silicon Valley. But these types of rapid iterative testing, putting your engineers closer to the factory, so on and so forth, these were things the Russians had done previously to catch up on ICBM R&D as well. And so these were approaches that had actually worked in this technology category, in this product category, and he just moved them into a different space. So there wasn't as much innovation happening there initially as you might think, but there was a bigger idea, and there was, obviously the mastery of showmanship. But a lot of what he
Mm-hmm.
was doing was traditional strategy, blocking and tackling, and linking, removing as many unknowns from the system as possible, but doing it in a way where his competitors couldn't compete, and where he'd have an edge and he'd have some backing, if he ran into a wall, because he was delivering price competition for the first time in decades in the market.
Yeah, I really like the way that in your book you made him a case study of how he used a single spreadsheet, right,
Yeah.
chunking down all of the cost, the raw material, the labor, and all that
Yeah.
stuff, to
Yeah.
say, all right, it takes about $200,000 to raw material to make a missile, and then use that spreadsheet to launch
Right.
not missile rockets,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. So he goes down to, he's very, you kind of think about who he is, what's his background. So he has a degree in applied physics, and he has a degree in economics or the statistically driven finance from the Wharton School.
yeah.
So what's this guy really good at? He's good at first principles thinking. He thinks about what are the materials costs for this thing, and then he thinks about things in the statistical models and kind of observing systems and what economists call stock flow models. That's his kind of natural way of thinking. Uh, and so when he started taking a look at these systems, he said, okay, the cost of a rocket, the materials cost, the steel, the copper, the whatever, is about 2% of the cost of the actual rocket. Most of the rest of it is labor and overhead tooling and all of this stuff. How can I remove all of those pieces? Can I take new Aero Astro kids who don't have opportunities in Boeing because those things are slowing down, give them opportunities, give them responsibilities? Can I put them closer to the means of production so that they can figure out ways to cost reduce or remove external vendors from the system and all of those things that Congress loves, but aren't good for a private business? And so at one point, I think he's trying to build shells for his rockets, and he's going to companies that make canisters, large canisters for dairy, right? To hold milk. These giant cylinders to hold milk.
Right.
Instead of going to like whoever, Ball Aerospace or whoever it is that does that for everyone else. I don't know if that solution worked, but the point was he was looking at where are adjacencies that I can take advantage of that removes tremendous amounts of cost from my system, whether it's labor, whether it's other people who have the existing tooling and skill set in a much lower margin business.
Yeah. And I think let's see, the insight that he has, which reduced a lot of costs, was, hey, let's make the body or whatever the thing is called reusable. Boom,
Mhm.
that insight, right? But I think what makes it compelling.
It took almost 20 years to get there, by the way. Like it wasn't like that happened overnight. But
Mm,
that was early on a goal.
So I guess I'm not Elon Musk, right? Don't plan to be. Don't want his job at all. But what I love, but I love the systematic way of
Yeah.
thinking about things, right? So that way
Yeah.
we can. I think in your book, again, I'm paraphrasing, is the reason why you want a systems, so that way you can duplicate, right? This exploration of possibilities and then solutions, and really
Right.
think it through, versus just a serendipitous event, a divine insight. You had a thing in a shower, and that may or may not work, but
Right.
that is not anti-fragile, right? So, but having a system, I love systems, as you
Mm-hmm.
can feel my passion.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I love talking to a fellow systems guy. So okay.
You can solve different kinds of problems. I think that both of these things are true, right? That you need to get away, you need to take a shower, you need to overwhelm your senses so that you can have new kinds of thoughts. I think that's important. But it really helps when those thoughts are occurring within a system and you know where those ideas fit as opposed to just kind of hoping.
Yeah. So okay, so let's help our listeners. Let's help me, right? Let's say I want to help the aging workforce problem, right? So let's go out and
Yeah.
build a system that helps me systematically explore the problem space, right?
Sure.
Market risk, technology risk, and then also the opportunities.
Okay.
How, like, just high level? I know you can go really geeky about the details. High level, how would you help someone create their own system?
So I think the first thing is to understand what are the major. We talked about rogue waves and these kind of undercurrents, these smaller waves that combine to create massive change. I think the first thing is understanding, what those things are. Not that any one of those will be the seed of a massive change, but once that spark hits, they will drive the spread. And in the when I was at HP, we did several years of work on identifying what those major knowable trackable changes will be over the 2020s, and we talk about them in the book. Obviously, there's a whole chapter, but the first thing is starting there. Like, what are the major social trends? uh, what are the major economic trends? What are the major technological trends that we see happening that individually could have significant impact, but when they overlap could have massive impact? So you were talking about changing demographics, right? That we have this older population. And you were talking earlier about artificial intelligence, right? Can we start to use automation tools, robots, and so on and so forth to start to backfill labor shortages? Yeah, there's another thing to be thinking about here, which is, at least in the United States, the vast majority of our economy, something like 67%, is driven by consumption. This is why, in the face of COVID, when the economy shut down, we had all of the stimulus spending, and we were just trying to keep the money rolling,
Mm,
paychecks to people who were unemployed, just
mm,
so that there was rapid spending in the economy to keep the machine running.
mm,
As we
mm,
get older, right, we're going to see people spending less, we're going to see people earning less, and we're going to see more pushes on the pressure on the social safety net, right? When you take a look at, you know, uh, uh, healthcare spending, half of that is government, right? Whether it's veterans, or whether it's, Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid spending. That's a huge issue when all of those things accelerate, coming out of Afghanistan, coming out of um, the Middle East, these continuous wars, that you have lifetime healthcare costs, and at the same time you have an explosion of individual healthcare costs. In fact, if you just follow linear projections, I think it's well over a quarter of GDP of the global of the U.S. Total economic spend by 2030. I mean, that's not viable to have that kind of a drag on an economy and see growth, right? Like that just makes no sense. And so, one of the places where you could really think about, uh, the social impact on this, right? So we talked about the economics, the changing demographics, the technology, the social impact, right? Is that Congress is going to have to do something, right? They're going to have to figure out how to constrain healthcare costs, and they're going to have to figure out how to decrease Social Security, Medicare payouts eventually. And so what we've seen is that retirement age has gone up in the last number of years to try and deal with this. We've seen, you're seeing this discussion about Medicare negotiating for drugs, to try and deal with this. But there's going to be increasing pressure, in places like uh, healthcare administration, which was one of the massively growing areas over the last 20 years in healthcare costs. How do you just kind of bat down the cost of private administration? Does it make sense for private insurers to be a part of the system? Does it make sense for uh, a lot of doctors are saying, hey, we won't work with Medicare and Medicaid? You know should that be a free market? I think this is going to be a real discussion in the next decade of, should your hip replacement doctor be able to set their own price? Should your
yeah.
general practitioner be able to set their own price? In much of the world, that's not how it works. So I think my point is, if you have this larger picture of what's going on around you, and what could happen if these issues start to overlap, you can start to prepare yourself to take advantage of them. So one of the things we did at HP, looking at those specific issues, right, that we're going to have these tools to automate, to improve diagnostics, so on and so forth. We're going to have an explosion of healthcare needs. We're going to have an explosion of um, uh, interest in how do you decrease the cost of healthcare. One of the key things is getting diagnosis earlier, so that you can start to manage disease before it gets out of control.
Mm,
Um, and so, while we can't talk too much about it yet, we've publicly announced, or the company's publicly announced, a smart diagnostics capability that they're rolling out. And
mm,
part of the goal of that was looking at these changing demographics. But we'd also said, hey, this probability of a pandemic is going up. So how do we create the question was, how do we create a business that's going to has a chance of being successful no matter what? That's going to have good compound growth. But at the same
mm,
time, how do we create a business that takes advantage of that? Sorry, the camera's a little goofy, but it takes advantage of volatility, that takes advantage of rogue waves. And if you can do both of those things, have a business that's going to be pretty good if the future doesn't happen, and have a business that's going to be great if it does, that's when you have a real win.
Mm,
So it's
yeah.
really about looking at that bigger picture, not because you shouldn't be trying to hit the quarter or do projections or be a responsible product manager or meet shareholder responsibilities. It's
I-
because if you have something that does both, you have the opportunity to have what I call a Zoom moment, right? Where Zoom walked into 2020 and they didn't expect to do 26 times growth, or an Amazon moment where they walked into 2020 and they didn't think that in 90 days they were going to do 10 years of growth in their retail business, in their online retail store business. Like, that wasn't on their agenda. But both companies were set up to take care of the scaling if it happened. And I think
so
that's the real thing. They were able to absorb the growth when the
so let's
opportunity
actually,
was there.
yeah, let's actually drill in on that real quick. Again, let's bring back the dojo analogy a bit, so it's a little bit more practical for someone who's not running Zoom, or on Amazon and so forth, right?
For sure.
So the idea of dojo practice is you want to practice daily, right? Or
Yeah.
whenever you go on there, so then you're well versed, you're well prepared. Train the conscious competence skills into unconscious competence skills. So when
Mhm.
the time hits, you can react muscle memory style, right? So now bring it to the idea of what we're talking about, the anti-fragility training, the resiliency
Mhm.
training, right? What is the motivation to do that? One.
Mhm.
Two, how do you keep that positive mindset? Because let's say if you look at just all of the rising costs, you're like, oh my gosh, it's so overwhelming, right? So how do you keep a positive mindset there? And then three, how do you concretely level up in your resiliency training? Like, what
Mhm.
is the frequency, the indicator that you're actually leveling up? Because I assume if I throw you a difficult problem right now,
Mhm.
you're calm as a cucumber because you've been
Mhm.
doing this for a while, right?
Mhm.
So what are some of the, so I guess that's a multi-layer question. Pick whichever that you feel like answering first.
Yeah. Um, I can answer how it's happened for me. Um, so I do a number of things in my life that aren't comfortable. Uh, I constantly choose to learn skills that I suck at. Uh, you know, and why do I do that? Uh, I do that to not just to learn those skills. The skills are irrelevant. It's to practice being in that ambiguous space, being in that world of unknowns. Um, the result over time is that I'm highly skilled in this really broad range of things, ranging from, I cook at an incredibly, very, very high level to I'm comfortable dealing, with economics issues to um, I failed algebra 3 times in high school. Um, and yet I spent a lot of time learning about mathematics and mathematical concepts. So I'm very comfortable talking with, statisticians, talking with economists about these issues, even if they're things that for whatever neurological reasons I can't do. Right? I understand how to talk about them and how to work with them. And I'm always going out and trying to touch those new spaces. Like I said, I'm a learner, right? That's my jam. So that's one thing. The second is being really clear about what your goal is, about what you want to learn. So when I was learning how to cook, um, my goal was I'm a really mediocre process manager, and I wanted to learn how to manage really complex processes in real time. And so what I was learning how to cook wasn't just how to cook, the perfect
Mm,
egg. It was how do I cook a 12 or 20 course Michelin star meal?
mm,
Not because it's a good idea for me to be a Michelin star chef,
mm,
but because if you're dealing with producing 100 different components, putting them on the plate, feeding them to everybody at the right temperature, and you're doing that over a course of days, then you become really good at process management, right?
Mm.
How to plan the thing, how to organize the design of the meal, how to think through the recipes, how to think through the production processes, and so on and so forth. And that hobby is actually at one point became a professional part of my life,
Mm.
but at the same time, it taught all of these other skills I needed to know to be an effective operator, especially dealing with new types of situations. How to remove all of the unnecessary risk from a complex and kind of chaotic project.
Mm. Mm. I love it.
And
Thank you
so
for that.
that's kind of my recommendation. Find something fun. Uh, find something fun that you suck at, that will teach you the skills that you need to
Yeah.
do what you want to do. It's I don't recommend the Mr. Miyagi school where it's like, let's wax a bunch of cars. Like, there are more
Yeah.
fun things you can probably do with your life.
No, that's an interesting insight though. So let me just bring in a mental model that a lot of people use, right? So there are 4 stages of learning: unconscious incompetence, right? Conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence, right? So as you move through the different stages.
Uh-huh.
Now, what you were telling, so the second stage, the conscious incompetence part is the most painful,
Yeah.
right? So what implicit, you didn't say this, but you're implying that embrace the discomfort. This part is the part where it helps you to be more resilient in also other areas as well. And then also find a skill that you do desire to learn and embrace the conscious incompetence part. Is that, what do you say to that?
I think that's true. I think there is another piece within this. Nolan Bushnell says something along the line, the inventor of Atari. He says something along the lines of, the most fun games are the ones that are easy to learn but hard to master.
Mm.
And uh, within cooking, for me, one of the most powerful things was learning how to break down the individual lessons so that they were easy to learn, but maybe a little hard to master. So if you want to learn how to use a stovetop, for instance,
Mm.
like, learn how to make a perfect French omelet. Like that, if you will learn how to see the temperature, smell the temperature of the oven, understand everything about that system. Because if your egg, which is paper thin, is off by half a degree, it will of temperature, it will change the texture of the omelet. And so you learn how to get really precise just doing this one thing, making 100 omelets, right?
Mm.
And that one skill, that one Mr. Miyagi skill of the wax on, wax off from the Karate Kid, you know, it plays out in 100 different applications uh, in the kitchen.
Mm.
It plays out in anything you could possibly cook, understanding temperature in the kitchen, and how to do it in an intuitive way. So it's not like I have to click the things in and have the thermometer going. Like, that's all important too. But those are training wheels that help you build the intuition.
What, by the way, this is aside, we can move on to another topic if you want, but since we're talking about learning, are you
Mhm.
more of an intense learner, like I gotta hit 100 omelets today kind of a thing, or are you more of a joyous learner? I will cook as long as I feel I enjoy this process, then I'll stop. And so then that way I don't carry on the emotional energy of being too difficult. Like, what style learner are you?
I'm an obsessive learner. Is there a third style?
Explain. What does that
um,
mean? Obsessive learner.
like, I think it's probably the 100 omelets. Like,
Mm.
I know that for me, the way to my wife is different. She's kind of the joyous learner of, I'll do it till I'm bored. For me, my work ethic is about knowing that I'm hitting my marks. It's not because I care
Mm.
about making lists or achieving lists or any of those things. I just want to know that I've gotten to a skill level so that when I come back, I'm at that skill level and I'm not starting over again. So for a lot of those repetitive things, it's about that. But the other thing about learning skills, like Wynton Marsalis, the cornetist trumpet player, I forget if he's a cornetist or a trumpet player, but jazz musician. He talks about practice, and he says, at the beginning, I practiced 8 hours a day because I didn't know what I was practicing. Today, I practice 15 minutes a day because I know exactly what I'm trying to learn. And I think there are different stages in learning any skill, right? Like today, when I'm learning, when I'm learning something new in cooking, it's a very, very small thing, and I know exactly, what I'm trying to accomplish in most cases. I wouldn't say that 15 years ago, I knew that. I was just like, I went to this Michelin star restaurant, and it was my first real experience with fine dining, and it was like that was unbelievable. I don't know how that happened. I don't know how food could have moved from what it always had to this entirely elevated level. And it was about like learning, and I couldn't have broken down the individual steps. 15 years ago, I had to kind of go through that I'm not a good school learner, so I have to kind of go through that head beating process to figure out what those parts are. So I think it's a kind of a combination. The joyous learning has got to be what happens when you're figuring out what the parts are. Like you just got to assume you're going to suck, and then you can start to be a little more intentional, maybe once you know what the intention is.
Yeah. It's baby steps. I mean, dude, so many parallels about even like meditation or exercising or even psychedelics or book writing. There are so many parallels there. But this is not about learning so much. I'm gonna move on to your book. So bring in this framework for someone who you're teaching, the anti-fragility, the resilience training, the looking out into the world, really sort of far ahead, right? Seeing the rogue waves coming, the undercurrent, and then the rogue waves. What specific skills in terms of which data to look at, what to look at, what do they track, so that way you can walk someone who is maybe a white belt in looking at this to where you're at, right? Black belt. Like what skills would you say?
So I think the first thing is really understanding, 3 underlying principles of what I call resilient growth. The first is awareness, right? If you're not aware of why you need to change, or your people aren't aware of why they need to change because of things in the external environment, why would they? What they're doing has worked. The second is around behavior, right? So if you see the rogue wave coming, if you see the tsunami on the beach, if you don't have the skills to get off the beach, to understand, to take advantage of, and be resilient to change, then it doesn't matter that you see the wave coming. And then the third, and this is perhaps the most important part, is creating a culture that looks out onto the horizon as well as looking inwardly. And many organizations, maybe even most, the focus is really on financial and operational efficiency. When what we've realized between 1999 and 2019 is that 3/4 of the causes of sustained decreases in business value, are rogue waves. They're massive external changes. They're massive failures in strategy that rippled back into the company. And so, what we need to be thinking about is how to create a culture, how to create this hard and soft incentives, the communication structures in our companies and in our lives that allow that looking out while focusing on performance inside. Kind of very much like you were saying about the point of mastery is understanding what's going out on the world in the hearts of others and in your own heart. So I think those are the three major skills. So how do you start, right? It doesn't really matter where you start. It's with any of these. But the place you can start today is reading the newspaper, ideally a better one like The Economist, or I like the Nikkei Asian Review. And instead of looking at a headline, look at all of the headlines, and then like maybe write a list. Go back 3 months, random day, write down all of the headlines from the different sections, and then look at what they mean together, right? Not individually, like China does this, the US does this, Modi in India does this, supply chain disruption over here. Like, look at them in aggregate. Look at the whole newspaper instead of any individual headline, and practice doing that. Practice looking at what are the social, what are the economic, what are the technological changes that are going on around us. And then asking if these overlapped, if these hit me simultaneously, what would they mean for me? Right? How would I take advantage of them? Because the issue is never, or very rarely, one thing. It's a combination of things. When you take a look at the 2008 financial crash, right? What was really going on? Construction labor is one of the major drivers of economic growth in the United States. Congress was trying to drive that. One of the major causes of wealth growth in the United States is when families become homeowners, so that they lock in their cost, the cost of housing. We saw a shift in the way we were managing risk. We were starting to use new statistical tools to build derivatives to balance risk in really complex ways. And what happened when the economy slowed down is all of that cascaded one into another into another. Most people didn't see this coming. The ones that did, they did really, really, really well, right? The Ray Dalios of the world did really, really, really well in that situation. Not because they were smarter than you or than me or than anybody else. It's because they took the time to look under the sheets and see, to see if there was anything there.
So on that
And so
note, real quick,
that's the real skill, is like learning how to like stop reading the New York Post and stop reading
yeah,
Facebook. Get into harder, heavier data. Look at it in aggregate instead of individually. And then
yeah.
ask what would happen if this collided. These things that might be happening in India or might be happening in Myanmar or Lagos. What would happen to me if they happened here?
Yeah. I really appreciate that, by the way. I have been accused of being too much of a monk, too much of a geek, because I like to just do, read stuff in my cave, what I'm interested in.
Mhm.
And my rationalization is that, hey, if it's outside of my sphere of influence, it's not, I can't do anything about it. It amps up my nervous energy, so I rather not, right? But in this conversation, it helps me to like, okay, so there are tactical skills I can learn to also practice the wide angle lens, right, on the daily, and also see the relevance. So it's not just hey, things are happening out there, but now this practice, this specific practice helps me to think the relevance to my small world here on the internet, kind of a thing. So I really appreciate this.
I appreciate that idea that I'm appreciating the dojo model more as we're talking. And that's exactly what it is. It's how do I simulate? Why do I simulate these things? It's to figure out how I can use the tools that I have, that what is in my sphere of influence, to take advantage of it. And if there are more, you kind of asked what's the first step, right? The second step is figuring out, okay, what steps can I take to increase my optionality, right? To increase my potential if those things happen, to increase my sphere of influence if change occurs. Because the one thing we know is that change is a constant. I happen to believe, maybe you do, that the world is moving faster. I happen to believe that our data systems, our economic systems, our supply chains, our politics are becoming more globally connected. And that means that we're going to have more volatility, right? Things are moving faster. There's more energy in the system. Things that used to happen over there, it took 60 years for the Black Plague to get from Europe, from Asia to Europe. It took what, a sneeze in a couple of days for it to get from Wuhan to the United
Mm-hmm.
States,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like things that used to not matter because they happened over there suddenly matter because they happen over here. And so we've got to take this global perspective, and we've got to think about the world, a world where volatility is the norm, where change is the norm, where rogue waves are the norm instead of the edge case.
Yeah. So quick question there. Use Bridgewater as an example, right? Dalio, Bridgewater, they were able to benefit from their insight, right? Their discipline, right? Their mastery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of, and I think it's well, they're a hedge fund company, right? And individual contributors vote yay or nay within their culture of what to invest. And there's a direct incentive to perform at a high level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing far ahead, seeing the
Yep.
risk and so forth.
Yep.
Not so obvious in other cases per se. Let's say in regular businesses, they don't necessarily, well, so a little background. I was a chief culture officer for a startup of 250 people. One insight that I got as during my tenure there is you get what you incentivize monetarily as well
You
as social
sure
status
do.
wise, right?
You sure
So
do.
then, so then how do you create the incentive structure, monetary or social,
Mm.
to look ahead for risk as well as opportunities? Like
Mm.
this would make what you were saying even more concrete and tactical for
Mm.
people who run their organizations.
Mm. So if you run I think there are three questions within this. One, if you run the organization and you dominate the board, there's one set of answers. Two, if you're a middle manager in an organization where you don't do that, there's a second set of answers. And third, if you're an employee, um, uh, there's a third set of answers. So if you run the organization, we talk a lot about how to in chapter 8 of the book. We talk a lot about how to create processes and incentives that encourage people to look outside uh, of the organization and to create a driver to drive innovation in the organization. And it really comes down to love people for the quality of their experiments and the quality of their thinking as opposed to the results. Yeah, the second you start, you know, rewarding people for the quality of their results, they're going to do things that they know will be successful before they start. Lots of places where you want to do that, but not when you're asking people to experiment and innovate. Because by definition, if you're asking them to experiment and innovate, you're in a situation where failure is also a known outcome. And
Yep.
and you don't want, you know, you don't want people to telling you that you're, HIV negative when you're HIV positive, right? Like you really want the right data and you really
That's
want
right.
the right experiments.
That's
So
right.
so make sure that you're encouraging that and you're paying people to do experiments as opposed to do experiments that have the results you want.
Hold
The
on.
second,
So hold on. So
yeah,
quick interjection. So what I'm hearing you say is reward them for the rigor of their experiment. Correct?
the rigor of the experimental design,
Correct.
the rigor of running the experiments, and the rigor of sort of the insight that leads the hypothesis that leads to the experiment. Right? That's totally different from rewarding people for the outcome.
So if you don't mind, let's drill in even further. So reward means what? Like, hey, so if sales is easy, right? You get percentage commission. That's easy. How do you reward rigor
Mhm.
of an experimental design? Like it's not as a direct percentage of outcome or
Yeah,
kind of a thing.
no, it's harder for management. I'm not denying that. But we talk about 5 steps in this process in the book. Kind of how do you assess the start point? How do you look at where this experiment would exist within a system? How do you look at the range of possible outcomes? How do you uncouple threats and opportunities so that you're minimizing downside risk and maximizing opportunity? And how do you, in many research programs, it's not one experiment, it's a battery of experiments. And how do you reward uh, looking at the experiments as a portfolio as opposed to individual experiments? Like, what's the success of the portfolio? Because you can if you do enough experiments statistically, they should add up to more than the sum of the parts. And so it's really about that, asking people to do that kind of metacognition, and framing up why they're doing what they're doing, not because they shouldn't be intuitive in what they're doing, uh, and not because they know why they're doing it necessarily before they start, but at some point that should be a part of the process, right? And that's what you want to be encouraging. The second thing is that I think is really interesting is rewarding people for cutting their own projects,
Mm,
right? Like, that's a really weird idea. But why don't we do that? Like, when someone says, "Hey, we started off, we thought this was a good idea. Turns out that it was dumb. I'm going to cut it before anyone else complains." We should
mm,
reward that instead of what I see in a lot of corporate cultures, which is hiding failure. Right? The second
mm,
you hide failure, you remove the ability to learn from it. The third piece, and I can feel what's going on in people's heads right now. So I want people to just to take unlimited risks and fail a lot. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Um, it's not unless you talk to them in terms of risk bands. What's the most and what's the least amount of risk that you'll tolerate from them?
mm,
Right. So you're rewarding them for a certain amount of failure and you're rewarding them for a certain amount of success. And that should be different for different roles in different places, in different people levels within your organization. But you've got to look at both sides of that coin.
mm.
If you just say, here's the maximum amount of risk I want you to take, what you're doing is you're just incentivizing everybody to be sheep. And that's not what any of us want as leaders.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And then in my mind, what brings to mind is basically how do you draw boundaries around it? Maybe a
Yeah.
duration, maybe some amount of budget, maybe an amount of personnel, or perhaps even like reputational risk, things
Yep.
like that. So
Yep.
that way there's some boundaries
Yeah.
around, hey, you,
I think,
you can
yeah.
roam inside of this
Yeah. I
area.
mean, I want you to take this much a reputational risk. I think that's a powerful, and saying it publicly, right? So you
Mm,
inoculate them against it. Like, I think that's a really powerful way of potentially looking at these kinds of things,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? Like, I want you to fail 30% of the time. If you're not failing 30% of the time, I don't want to hear from you.
mm-hmm,
Like, it's a weird idea, but how else do you encourage it and give permission?
mm. Lastly, and I'm watching the time, man, an hour and a half go by quick. So you're the black belt, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if you have any plan, right? Here's an idea, what I desire, right? And you can do whatever you want with it. Is, hey, I want to get better at this.
Okay.
I want to study with Jonathan, right? Why
Okay.
why doesn't Jonathan start his own dojo? So that way people who are interested, right, in
Yeah.
learning these
Yeah.
resiliency skills and
Yeah.
anti-fragile skills and really thinking about
Yeah.
things as a leader, as a contributor, as a manager, whatever level they're at, as an
Yeah.
entrepreneur, as like a visioneer, can say, all right, Jonathan has a framework and he has made, some tools to make it easier for people to grasp basically go from white belt to black belt. So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
an idea for you. Whatever you want to do with it, it's up to you.
I would love to do that. We're in the process of building out training modules and all of those things right now. I think going back to what you're saying, I think a lot of this is experiential. You can't read about, you know, jujitsu. Like, you got to do it, and I'd love to, as things get a little better here, figure out how we can do some experiential training together.
Yeah, I think it's super worthwhile. I mean, especially right, the premise before you even begin all of this, whether you like it or not, the world is becoming more volatile, so to speak, right? Things are coming online, things are changing quickly, and politically or otherwise, there's a lot of moving parts. And from my perspective, from the more spiritual perspective, control was an illusion anyway. So, so if that's the case, then might as well learn these key skills so then you can navigate, be a free agent, and navigate and thrive in this
Yeah.
future that has more possibilities.
Well, there's more potential and more options than ever, and they're popping up faster than they ever have before. And I think that's the thing that we forget. The reason the world is scary right now is we're starting to be able to see the future in a real way for the first time. And that means that you can see the future in a real way for the first time. This is your opportunity to change it, to shape it, to surf the next wave.
I'm excited. I love the idea of becoming a big wave surfer, right? Ride these 100 feet, rogue waves. I don't swim, but I like the idea of it. I'm very enamored by it. So really appreciate the way you showed up, Jonathan. I really,
There,
and what a
there's
beautiful
there's
book.
your next skill to learn, CK.
There you go. There you go. Put my life on the line on this
Love
podcast
it.
here. Hey
Love it.
man, go get the book Rogue Waves: Future Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. Thank you so
And
much for being here.
and feel free to reach out to me either on my website, jonathanbrill.com, or please follow me on LinkedIn. That's where you're going to find the latest from HBR, Forbes, Inc., anywhere else I might be today.